There are stories America has tried to forget, stories too dark, too twisted, too close to the bone to ever speak of in daylight. They exist in the cracks between census records, in burnt hospital files, in the silence of rural towns where everyone knows but no one speaks. This is one of those stories, a story about a girl who became a mother to her own sister, about a father who built a kingdom of silence, about a family that became its own terrible secret. What you're about to hear happened in America. In living memory, the people involved had neighbors, had friends, had jobs and church pews and family reunions, and for decades no one knew, or perhaps more terrifyingly, they knew and chose to look away. This is the story of a daughter who bore her own sister. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Silence, then a breath. Her name was Sarah Mae Thornton, and this is what happened in the house at the end of Morgan Road. The house still stands, though no one's lived there since 2003. White paint peeling like dead skin, windows that reflect nothing, even in full sun, the mailbox leaning at an angle that suggests surrender. If you drive past it on State Route 47 in rural Kentucky, you might notice it for half a second, then forget it just as quickly. That's what houses like this do. They teach you to forget. The Thornton family moved there in 1976. Martin Thornton, his wife Rebecca, and their 4 children, David, the oldest at 13, Sarah Mae at 11, and the twins, Jacob and Emma, just 6 years old. Martin worked at the lumber mill. Rebecca kept the home. They attended the Baptist church every Sunday, where Martin's deep voice could be heard singing hymns 3 pews away. To everyone in Harlan County, they were ordinary. Maybe even ideal, the kind of family that appears in old photographs with genuine smiles, the kind neighbors point to and say, "Now there's good people." But houses keep secrets better than people do. And the house on Morgan Road kept secrets that would have made the foundations crack if they could speak. Sarah Mae was 11 when they moved in, blonde hair in braids, freckles across her nose. The kind of little girl who helped her mother with the younger kids, who got good grades, who said yes, sir, and no, ma'am, without being reminded. In the only photograph that survives from that first year, she's standing in front of the house wearing a yellow dress, her hand shading her eyes from the sun. She's smiling, but if you look closely, if you really look, her shoulders are pulled inward, as if she's trying to make herself smaller. It's a posture you learn, a posture that says, "Don't see me, please don't see me." By the time Sarah Mae turned 12, her mother Rebecca had stopped meeting her eyes. It wasn't a conscious choice at first, the way cruelty often isn't. It was easier to look at the floor, at the dishes, at anything but the growing knowledge that something in her home had gone terribly, unspeakably wrong. Martin Thornton was 6'3", broad, shouldered from years of manual labor. He had a voice that carried, the kind of voice that makes people pay attention whether they want to or not. At church, people respected him. At work, they feared him just enough to stay out of his way. At home, he was God and judge and jury all at once. The first time it happened, Sarah Mae was 12 years old. We know this not from her testimony, because Sarah Mae never testified. We know this from medical records that surfaced decades later, records that had been misfiled, misplaced, or perhaps deliberately hidden in the basement archives of County General Hospital. Records that showed a 12-year-old girl brought in by her father for stomach pain. Records that noted bruising, records where a nurse had written something in the margins, then crossed it out so thoroughly the paper tore. Whatever that nurse suspected, she never reported it. In 1977, in rural Kentucky, you didn't accuse a man like Martin Thornton of anything. You minded your business, you went to church, you sang your hymns and you kept your mouth shut, and you told yourself that what happens in a man's home is between him and the Lord. Sarah Mee stopped going to school regularly when she was 13. The official reason given was illness. Chronic migraines, Rebecca told the school secretary. The girl just needs rest, needs quiet, needs to be home where her mother can care for her. But Sarah Mee wasn't resting. She was being erased, piece by piece, day by day, in that house at the end of Morgan Road. Her father had decided she belonged to him in a way that fathers should never believe, and her mother, whether from fear or denial or some dark covenant of survival, had chosen to look away. By 14, Sarah Mee had stopped speaking in complete sentences. The few times she was seen in public, at the grocery store or sitting in the truck while Martin pumped gas, she kept her eyes down, didn't respond when people said hello, moved like someone walking through deep water, slow and careful, as if the world might shatter around her at any moment. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down, would later tell investigators that she remembered seeing Sarah Mee hanging laundry in the backyard one summer afternoon. This would have been 1979. Sarah Mee would have been 14. Mrs. Patterson said she waved, called out a greeting. Sarah Mee turned toward her, and for just a moment their eyes met. It was like looking at someone already dead. Mrs. Patterson said, like her soul had been scooped out, and all that was left was this girl. Shaped thing moving through the motions. I had nightmares about those eyes for weeks after, but I didn't say nothing to nobody. You didn't, back then. You just didn't. The summer Sarah Mee turned 15, she stopped appearing in public altogether. Martin told the neighbors she'd gone to stay with relatives in Tennessee. Said she needed a change of scenery, that the girl had been moody and difficult, and Rebecca couldn't handle her anymore. People nodded. Teenagers could be difficult, everyone knew that, and besides, Martin Thornton wasn't the kind of man you questioned, so they accepted the story and moved on with their lives and never asked when Sarah Mee would be coming back. She hadn't gone to Tennessee, she was still in the house, she'd been moved to the basement of the house on Morgan Road wasn't finished, concrete floor, exposed beams, a single bulb hanging from a wire. There was a mattress down there, thin and stained, a bucket in the corner, a small table with a Bible on it, because Martin Thornton believed in the word of God even as he committed acts that no God would forgive. He kept her there for 4 years in the dark, 4 years where the only voice she heard was his, coming down those wooden stairs, telling her that this was love, that this was natural, that this was what daughters were for. 4 years where her mother's footsteps crossed the floor above her head, back and forth, cooking dinner and folding laundry, and pretending that the muffled sounds from below were just the house settling, just the old pipes groaning, just anything other than what they really were. Sarah Mee became pregnant when she was 15 years old, then again at 16, then at 17, and finally at 18. The first 3 pregnancies ended in miscarriages. We know this from the medical records, from the hasty midnight visits to hospitals 2 counties away, where Martin would give false names and pay in cash and disappear before anyone could ask too many questions. The nurses and doctors who treated her must have known something was wrong. A teenage girl, obviously malnourished, obviously terrified, with injuries that couldn't be explained by any normal circumstances. But they treated her and took the money and filed the paperwork under names like Jane Smith and Mary Johnson and sent her back into the darkness, the 4th pregnancy carried to term. On March 17, 1983, in the basement of the house on Morgan Road, Sarah Mae Thornton gave birth to her father's child. She was 18 years old. She'd spent nearly 4 years in that basement by then. 4 years since she'd seen sunlight. 4 years since she'd spoken to anyone other than her father. 4 years of becoming something less than human in the eyes of her family, something to be hidden, something to be ashamed of, something to be used and discarded and forgotten. Her mother, Rebecca, delivered the baby, came down those basement stairs with towels and hot water like this was a normal birth, like this was a normal family welcoming a normal child. The labor lasted 14 hours. Sarah Mee screamed herself hoarse, but the house was far enough from the neighbors that no one heard. Or if they did, they convinced themselves it was an animal in distress, a fox or coyote caught in a trap. It's amazing what people can convince themselves of when the truth is too terrible to acknowledge. The baby was a girl, tiny, premature, but alive. Rebecca cut the cord and cleaned the infant and wrapped her in a blanket that had once belonged to one of the twins. Then she carried the baby upstairs, leaving Sarah Mee alone in the dark with her torn body and her shattered mind and her grief so deep it no longer had a name. They called the baby Grace. Told everyone Rebecca had been pregnant, but kept it quiet because of her age, because she'd had complications with the twins and didn't want to worry anyone. The town accepted this story with the same bland indifference they'd accepted all the other stories. Congratulations were offered. Casseroles were delivered. The church held a small celebration, and Martin Thornton stood at the front with his new daughter in his arms, accepting praise for his growing family, while his actual daughter bled and wept in the basement below his feet. Grace Thornton was raised as Sarah Mee's sister. She called Martin Daddy and Rebecca Mama, and never knew, in those early years, that the pale ghost who occasionally appeared at the top of the basement stairs was the woman who had carried her, birthed her, given her life at the cost of her own soul. Sarah Mee was allowed out of the basement after Grace was born, not free exactly, never free, but allowed to move through the house like a servant, like something owned. She cleaned, she cooked, she cared for Grace when Rebecca was tired. And at night, when the house was dark and quiet, her father still came to her room. The abuse didn't stop. It never stops, not in houses like this. It just becomes routine, normalized, the terrible rhythm of everyday horror. Sarah Mee learned to disappear inside her own mind during these visits. Learned to separate her consciousness from her body, to float somewhere above the bed and watch this thing happening to someone else, some other girl, not her, never her. Because if she admitted it was her, then she'd have to admit what her life had become, and that admission would kill her faster than anything her father could do. The children in the house, David and the twins, knew something was wrong. Children always know, but they'd been trained since birth not to question their father, not to speak out of turn, not to see what they weren't supposed to see. David, the oldest, left for the army as soon as he turned 18. He never came back, not even for visits, cut all contact with the family, and built a new life where the Thornton name meant nothing. The twins, Jacob and Emma, stayed. They were younger, more malleable. They learned to navigate around the truth, to step carefully through their days, to ignore the sounds at night and the hollow look in their older sister's eyes. They accepted baby Grace as their new sister without question, because questioning would mean acknowledging the unacknowledgeable, and children learn very quickly that some knowledge will destroy you. Grace grew up in that house thinking it was normal. She was a bright child, curious and energetic, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's, or rather her sister's, blonde hair. She called Sarah Mee by her first name, never sis or sister, just Sarah Mee, like she was an aunt or distant relative. Sarah Mee cared for her with a desperate, aching love that she could never fully express, would brush Grace's hair for hours, would read to her before bed, would watch her sleep and wonder if the little girl could feel it, the wrongness of it all, the cosmic injustice that made her both sister and daughter, both child and evidence. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The years passed in that terrible way time passes in places of suffering, days that feel like years, years that vanish like smoke. Sarah Mee aged rapidly. her youth stolen not just by her father, but by the weight of the secret she carried, the impossible knowledge that the little girl who called her by name was made from her flesh, born from her pain. By the time Sarah Mee was 25, she looked 40, gaunt, grey streaks in her hair, hands that shook when she thought no one was looking. She'd developed a habit of staring at nothing, just fixing her eyes on a point in space and disappearing into it for minutes at a time. The few people who saw her during these years, delivery drivers or repairmen who came to the house, would later describe her as off or strange or not quite right. None of them thought to ask why. None of them thought to question what kind of life would make a young woman look like a ghost in her own skin. Grace started school in 1989. She was 6 years old, the same age the twins had been when the family first moved to Morgan Road. She was a good student, teachers said, smart, polite, maybe a little too quiet, a little too eager to please, but nothing that raised red flags, nothing that made anyone look closer at the family she came from. At home, Grace was beginning to notice things. The way Sarah Mee flinched when Martin entered a room. The way Rebecca's voice got sharp and brittle when she spoke to Sarah Mee, but soft and gentle when she spoke to Grace. The way Sarah Mee would sometimes look at her with such profound sadness that it felt like drowning. One night, when Grace was 7, she woke up and heard crying. She followed the sound down the hallway to Sarah Mee's room. The door was cracked open. Inside, she could see her father standing over Sarah Mee's bed. She couldn't understand what was happening, not at that age, but she understood it was wrong, understood it was secret, understood that if she was caught watching, something terrible would happen. She went back to bed and never spoke of it, not to her mother, not to her siblings, not to anyone. The knowledge went into the same locked box where all the other unspoken horrors lived, and she learned to carry it the way everyone in that house learned to carry things, silently and alone, and with a smile fixed on her face whenever anyone was looking. Sarah Mee tried to kill herself when Grace was 8 years old. She took pills, whatever she could find in the bathroom cabinet. It wasn't enough. Rebecca found her in time, called Martin home from work, and together they forced her to vomit, to survive, to continue carrying the burden of existence in that house of horrors. They never took her to a hospital, never called for help, just watched her closely after that, made sure she couldn't access anything dangerous, added suicide watch to the long list of ways they imprisoned her, because Sarah Mee couldn't die. If Sarah Mee died, questions would be asked. If questions were asked, the truth might surface, and the truth could never, ever surface. The 1990s arrived. The world was changing, technology advancing, information spreading faster, but in the house on Morgan Road, time stood still in all the worst ways. Martin continued his abuse, older now but no less monstrous. Rebecca continued her willful blindness, her desperate performance of normalcy. The twins moved out one by one, escaping to college and jobs and lives where they didn't have to witness what they'd always pretended not to see. And Sarah Mee remained, because where would she go? She had no education beyond 8th grade. No job skills, no money, no friends, no one who even remembered she existed outside the walls of that house. She'd been erased so thoroughly from the world that her absence wouldn't even register. She was a ghost made flesh, haunting the same rooms where she'd died 1,000 deaths without the mercy of actual ending. Grace was 15 in 1998. The same age Sarah Mee had been when she was locked in the basement. And Grace was starting to ask questions about why Sarah Mee never left the house, about why her father's mood shifted so dramatically whenever Sarah Mee was mentioned, about the way Sarah Mee looked at her sometimes, with a mixture of love and grief so intense it felt like staring into the sun. One afternoon, when Rebecca was at the store and Martin was at work, Grace confronted Sarah Mee directly, asked her outright what was wrong. why she was so sad, why she seemed so broken. Sarah Mee looked at this 15-year-old girl, this beautiful child who was her sister and her daughter and her shame and her greatest love all at once, and she made a decision that would change everything. A decision that would finally, after decades of silence, tear open the terrible secret at the heart of the Thornton family. She told Grace the truth, not all of it, not the worst details, but enough. Enough that Grace understood who her real mother was. Enough that Grace understood what her father had done. Enough that Grace's world shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces right there in the kitchen of the house on Morgan Road. Grace ran out of the house, down the road, running blindly with tears streaming down her face and her mind trying desperately to reject what she'd just learned. She ran all the way to Mrs. Patterson's house, the neighbor 3 doors down, and she knocked on the door, and when Mrs. Patterson answered, Grace collapsed. Mrs. Patterson called the police. It was November 3rd, 1998, when the first patrol car pulled up to the house on Morgan Road. Officer James Whitley and Officer Sandra Chen. They'd been told a teenage girl was in distress, claiming something about abuse, about secrets, about her sister, who was really her mother. The dispatch had been confused. The officers weren't sure what they'd find. What they found was Sarah Mee, 33 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. When Officer Chen asked if she was okay, Sarah Mee started laughing. Not hysterical laughter, quiet laughter, the laughter of someone whose sanity had been fractured so many times it had turned into something sharp and strange and barely recognizable. "You want to know if I'm okay," Sarah Mee said. "I haven't been okay since I was 11 years old." And then, in that kitchen, to those 2 police officers who would later say they wished they'd never answered that call, Sarah Mae Thornton told her story. All of it, every terrible detail, every year in the basement, every pregnancy, every time her father came to her room, every moment her mother looked away, every second of the 2 decades she'd spent being systematically destroyed by the people who were supposed to protect her. Officer Whitley called for backup. Officer Chen sat with Sarah Mee, holding her hand, crying openly as the story unfolded. Within an hour, there were 6 police cars outside the house. Within 2 hours, Martin Thornton had been arrested at the lumber mill. Within 3 hours, Rebecca Thornton was in custody. Within 4 hours, the house was a crime scene, and Sarah Mee was finally free. But freedom, they would both learn, was more complicated than simply walking out the door. The trial began in June of 1999. The state of Kentucky versus Martin and Rebecca Thornton. The charges were extensive: rape, incest, child abuse, kidnapping, conspiracy, assault. The list went on and on, each charge a small word trying to contain an enormous horror. The media descended on Harlan County like locusts. This was the kind of story that made national news. The house of horrors. The daughter who gave birth to her sister. The parents who conspired in decades of abuse. Camera crews lined up outside the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions. The Thornton name became synonymous with everything dark and twisted and wrong with hidden America. Sarah Mee had to testify. Had to sit in that courtroom and speak the unspeakable while her father glared at her from the defendant's table, and her mother wept into her hands, and strangers in the gallery stared at her like she was an exhibit in a museum of human suffering. Her testimony lasted 3 days, 3 days of reliving every moment, every assault, every pregnancy, every year in the basement. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her, suggested she was mentally unstable, implied she was lying or exaggerating. But the evidence was overwhelming: medical records, DNA tests proving Martin was Grace's father, the testimony of the twins who finally, under oath, admitted what they'd always known. The physical evidence from the house itself, the basement room that still smelled like fear and despair even after months of being sealed off by the police. Martin Thornton was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, he showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead like he was already somewhere else, already gone, already erased from the world he'd poisoned. Rebecca Thornton was convicted of conspiracy and child endangerment. She could have been charged with more, but the prosecution offered a plea deal in exchange for her testimony. She received 25 years. At her sentencing, she finally spoke directly to Sarah Mee for the first time in decades. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said. "I was weak. I was scared. I failed you." Sarah Mee said nothing. Just looked at the woman who'd given birth to her and then sacrificed her to save herself. And in that look was every ounce of contempt and pity and exhausted grief that 2 decades of suffering could produce. The trial ended, the verdicts were rendered, justice in its imperfect way had been served, but justice doesn't heal wounds like these. Justice doesn't give you back the childhood that was stolen. Justice doesn't erase the memories or silence the nightmares or make you whole again. Grace was 17 when the trial concluded. She'd been in therapy since that November day when her world collapsed. She'd had to testify too, had to tell the court what little she remembered, what she'd witnessed, what she'd been told. She'd had to sit in the same room as the man she'd called Daddy, and learn that he was a monster who'd created her through an act of sustained evil. After the trial, Grace legally changed her name, took her mother's, or rather her grandmother's, maiden name. She finished high school under a different identity, moved to a different state, built a life as far from Harlan County as she could get. She cut all contact with the Thornton family. In interviews years later, she would say that Sarah Mee was the only one she missed, the only one she wished she could thank, the only one who truly loved her even when love was impossible. Sarah Mee tried to rebuild her life. Tried being the operative word. She moved to a small apartment in Lexington, got a job at a library, shelving books in quiet aisles where no one asked questions, went to therapy twice a week, took medication for depression and anxiety and PTSD and a dozen other diagnoses that tried and failed to capture the scope of her damage. But trauma like hers doesn't heal, it can't. It's woven too deeply into the fabric of who you are, into every cell and synapse and memory. Sarah Mee would wake up screaming, would have panic attacks in grocery stores, would see a man who looked like her father and freeze, unable to move, unable to breathe, transported instantly back to that basement, that room, that mattress, that endless dark. She tried dating once, a kind man she met at the library. He asked her to dinner, and she said yes, and they sat in a restaurant and made small talk, and when he reached across the table to hold her hand, Sarah Mee vomited. Just leaned over and threw up right there in the restaurant because his touch, innocent and gentle as it was, triggered every defense mechanism her body had learned over 20 years of abuse. She never dated again. In 2001, Sarah Mee wrote a book, a memoir titled The Basement. It was published by a small press and didn't sell many copies. The few reviews it received called it harrowing, difficult to read, almost too painful to finish. Sarah Mee did a handful of interviews, appeared on a couple of talk shows, spoke to victims' advocacy groups. She was articulate and honest and devastating in her clarity, but talking about it didn't help. Telling her story to strangers didn't heal the wounds. It just reopened them over and over, made her relive the trauma for audiences who would cry for her and then go home to their normal lives while she remained trapped in hers. She stopped doing interviews, stopped promoting the book, retreated back into her quiet life in Lexington, working at the library, seeing her therapist, existing in that strange liminal space between survivor and victim, between living and merely not dying. In 2007, Martin Thornton died in prison, heart attack. He was 68 years old. Sarah Mee was told by the state, asked if she wanted to claim the body. She said no, asked if she wanted to attend the funeral. She laughed, that same strange broken laugh from years before, and said there would be no funeral, that monsters don't deserve mourning. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered in a landfill, his name struck from every family record Sarah Mee could access. He ceased to exist except as a cautionary tale, a nightmare made flesh, a reminder that the worst monsters aren't hiding under beds or lurking in forests, but living in ordinary houses, singing hymns in church, shaking hands with neighbors while destroying their own children behind closed doors. Rebecca was released from prison in 2012 after serving 13 years. She moved to Tennessee, changed her name, tried to disappear into anonymity. She wrote letters to Sarah Mee, dozens of them, begging for forgiveness, trying to explain, trying to justify, trying to make sense of the choices she'd made. Sarah Mee never opened the letters, just collected them in a box and kept them in her closet, sealed and unread. What could her mother possibly say that would matter? What words could bridge the chasm between them? Rebecca had chosen a monster over her daughter, had stood by while her child was raped and imprisoned and destroyed, had delivered a baby conceived in incest and called it a blessing. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, some wounds too deep to heal. The house on Morgan Road sat empty for years. After it was released from being a crime scene, no one wanted to buy it. The bank foreclosed, it went to auction, someone bought it for almost nothing, probably investors who didn't know its history. But they couldn't rent it, couldn't sell it. The house had a reputation now. Everyone in Harlan County knew what had happened there, and houses like that, houses soaked in that much suffering, tend to stay empty, as if the walls themselves reject new inhabitants, as if the darkness inside has become so concentrated that normal life can no longer take root. Local teenagers sometimes dared each other to go inside, would break windows and spray paint the walls and tell each other ghost stories about the daughter in the basement, but most of them couldn't stay long. Would report feeling sick, feeling watched, feeling like the air itself was wrong. Maybe they were imagining it. Maybe trauma leaves a residue that sensitive people can feel. Or maybe they were just scared kids playing at being brave in a place where true horror had lived. Sarah Mee never went back, never drove past, never allowed herself to think about the physical space where her suffering had occurred. In therapy, they talk about exposure therapy, about confronting your trauma to defang it. But some traumas are too venomous to defang. Some places should never be revisited. Some memories are better left unexamined because examining them means living through them again and again and again. Grace reached out to Sarah Mee in 2015. She was 30, 2 years old, married, expecting her first child. She'd been in therapy for 16 years at that point, working through her own complicated grief and identity crisis, and the impossible burden of being both victim and product of incest. They met at a coffee shop in Louisville, neutral territory, neither of their homes. Sarah Mee was 50 years old, but looked 70, white hair, thin to the point of frailty, hands that still shook when she was nervous. Grace was beautiful, healthy, well, adjusted on the surface, though Sarah Mee could see the damage underneath, could recognize the same careful control she herself had learned, the same performance of normalcy that trauma survivors perfect. They talked for 3 hours, cried together, held hands across the table. Grace thanked Sarah Mee for telling the truth, for ending the cycle, for saving her from whatever hell would have continued if the secret had remained buried. Sarah Mee told Grace she loved her, had always loved her, would always love her, no matter how complicated and impossible that love was. They promised to stay in touch. They didn't. It was too hard, too much pain bundled up in every interaction. They sent Christmas cards for a few years, brief notes updating each other on their lives, but eventually even that stopped. Some relationships, no matter how much love exists, are too heavy with history to sustain. In 2017, a journalist from the New York Times tracked Sarah Mee down, wanted to do a long-form piece about her case, about incest in rural America, about the failures of the system that should have protected her. Sarah Mee agreed to one interview, one afternoon in her small apartment, drinking tea while a recorder sat between them on the coffee table. The journalist was young, maybe 28, 29. She asked her questions with careful compassion, never pushing too hard, always giving Sarah Mee space to pause, to breathe, to retreat when the memories became too much. At the end of the interview, she asked Sarah Mee if she had any advice for other survivors. Sarah Mee was quiet for a long time. Then she said this, and these are her exact words, preserved in the article that ran 6 months later. "People want me to say that survival is victory, that I'm brave, that I overcame, but I didn't overcome anything. I just didn't die, and most days I'm not even sure that was the right choice. What happened to me, what my father did, what my mother allowed, it didn't just hurt me for those years. It killed the person I could have been. I could have been anything, could have been someone who loved easily, who trusted people, who didn't wake up screaming, could have been someone who had children of her own and raised them with real love instead of this toxic, broken thing I learned in that house. My father didn't just abuse me, he murdered every possible version of my future. So no, I don't have advice. I don't have wisdom. I just have this reminder that some damage is permanent. That some people don't heal, and that's okay too. You don't have to be inspirational to deserve to exist." The article was published in September of 2017. It won awards, was shared widely on social media, sparked conversations about incest, about reporting requirements, about the ways communities fail vulnerable people. Sarah Mee's words became a touchstone for trauma survivors who were tired of being told to be strong, to overcome, to turn their pain into purpose. But Sarah Mee didn't read it, didn't want to see her life reduced to a narrative others could consume and share and feel moved by for 5 minutes before scrolling to the next thing. She'd told her story. It was done. She wanted only to be left alone. Rebecca Thornton died in 2019. Cancer. She'd been sick for months, but hadn't told anyone, hadn't sought treatment until it was too late. The official obituary listed no survivors, no family, mentioned nothing about her past, just said she'd been a homemaker, a church member, a resident of Tennessee, as if the most defining facts of her life, the monstrous choices she'd made, could be erased through omission. Sarah Mee learned about her mother's death from a distant cousin who found her contact information and thought she should know. Sarah Mee thanked the cousin and hung up the phone and felt nothing, not grief. Not relief, not anger, just a vast, echoing emptiness where complicated feelings should have been. Her mother was dead. The woman who'd given birth to her and then fed her to a monster was gone. And Sarah Mee realized she'd been dead to her mother long before the cancer. Probably dead from the moment Martin first touched her. Dead and buried and forgotten while still breathing. There was no funeral. No memorial, no gathering of family to mourn and remember. Rebecca Thornton was cremated and her ashes disposed of, and her name added to the long list of people who'd been part of the Thornton family horror and then ceased to matter. Sarah Mee continued her quiet life in Lexington. She'd been diagnosed with early onset dementia in 2018, possibly stress-related, possibly genetic, possibly just the accumulated weight of trauma destroying her brain the way it had destroyed everything else. She started forgetting things, would lose hours, would find herself in parts of town with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The library had to let her go when she started shelving books in random locations, her organizational systems breaking down as her mind did. She moved to an assisted living facility in 2020. She was 55 years old but needed the kind of care typically reserved for people decades older. The staff were kind, made sure she took her medications, helped her bathe and dress when she forgot how, sat with her during her bad episodes when she'd suddenly be back in the basement, screaming for a father who was long dead, reliving horrors that should have been buried with him. The COVID pandemic hit. The facility went into lockdown. Sarah Mee's last years were spent in even more isolation than before, alone in her small room, visited only by masked nurses who couldn't provide the human contact that might have anchored her to reality. She caught the virus in January of 2021. Her immune system, weakened by years of stress and trauma and the general deterioration of her body, couldn't fight it off. Sarah Mae Thornton died on February 2nd, 2021. She was 56 years old. The cause of death was listed as COVID-19 with contributing factors of dementia and major depressive disorder. No one was with her when she died. Pandemic restrictions. The staff did their best, held her hand through gloves, spoke comforting words through masks. But she died alone, the way she'd lived most of her life, isolated and forgotten by a world that had moved on from her story. There was no obituary, no funeral, no marker to show that Sarah Mae Thornton had existed, had survived, had endured more than most people could imagine, and somehow kept breathing for 56 years despite every reason to stop. Grace found out about her death through a social worker who'd tracked her down, thought she should know. Grace cried, arranged for a small cremation, scattered Sarah Mee's ashes in a garden, somewhere peaceful, somewhere far from Kentucky and the house on Morgan Road and the basement where her life had been stolen. The house still stands, still empty, still rotting slowly at the end of Morgan Road. The town's tried to forget, tried to move on, but there are stories that won't stay buried, stories that seep into the groundwater and infect everything they touch. People who drive past the house report strange feelings, a heaviness in the chest, a sudden urge to cry without knowing why. Some say they see a pale figure in one of the upstairs windows, a girl with blonde hair, watching the road. But that's probably just local legend, the kind of ghost story rural communities tell themselves to make sense of evil they can't explain. The lumber mill where Martin worked closed in 2010. The Baptist church where the Thorntons sang hymns every Sunday was torn down in 2016. The elementary school Grace attended was consolidated with another district. The physical landmarks of the story are disappearing one by one, erased by time and economics and the natural decay of small-town America. Soon there will be nothing left to mark what happened there. Nothing but the house, and eventually that too will fall, but the story persists, because stories like this always do. They circulate on true crime forums and Reddit threads. They are featured in podcasts and YouTube documentaries. They are studied in psychology courses and criminal justice programs. The Thornton case, they call it, a textbook example of familial abuse, systemic failure, and the capacity for human evil in ordinary settings. What they don't study is how Sarah Mae felt on ordinary Tuesdays in 2012, making herself breakfast in a small apartment, trying to remember what normal people do with freedom when they finally have it. They don't examine the specific shade of grey her world became, the way trauma bleaches color from everything until you're living in a permanent twilight. They don't count the number of times she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person looking back. They don't measure the distance between surviving and living and finding that distance is an unbridgeable chasm. Grace is 40, 2 years old now, in 2025. She has 2 children, works as an accountant, lives in Oregon under a name that has no connection to Thornton or Harlan County or the darkness she was born from. Her children know nothing about where they really come from. How could she tell them? How do you explain to your daughter that her grandmother was also her great-grandmother? that she exists because of an act of sustained horror, that the family tree is less a tree and more a twisted knot that shouldn't exist in nature. Grace still has nightmares, still sees a therapist every week, still struggles with intimacy and trust and the feeling that she's fundamentally wrong somehow, broken at a molecular level by the circumstances of her conception. She's tried to have a normal life, and in many ways she's succeeded, but normal is a performance for people like her, a carefully maintained illusion. One wrong thought, one triggered memory, and the whole thing collapses. She thinks about Sarah Mee often, wonders what her life would have been if she'd been born into different circumstances, wonders if Sarah Mee ever found any peace, any moments of genuine happiness among all that suffering. Wonders if she suffered more or less for having told the truth, for having broken the silence that protected her family and destroyed her. There's no good answer. Truth telling doesn't guarantee healing. Justice doesn't guarantee peace. Some survivors speak out and find liberation. Others speak out and find only that their trauma is now public property, consumed and commodified by strangers who will never understand what it cost to speak. The twins, Jacob and Emma, are in their 50s now. They've never spoken publicly about what happened, refused all interview requests, changed their names and moved away and built lives where the Thornton story is buried so deep they can pretend it never happened. They don't speak to each other, haven't since the trial. Too much shared knowledge, too many years of complicity they'd rather forget. Jacob became an engineer, lives in Colorado, married, divorced, married again. Has 3 kids who think their father's family died when he was young. He's never corrected this impression. It's easier than explaining that his family didn't die, they just became unspeakable. Emma works in social services, ironically enough. Specializes in child welfare cases. Some people might see this as atonement, an attempt to protect children the way she failed to protect Sarah Mee. Others might see it as compulsive reenactment, returning to the scene of trauma in an unconscious attempt to rewrite it. Emma herself doesn't examine her motivations too closely, just does her job, saves the kids she can, tries not to think about the one she couldn't. David, the oldest, died in 2009. Heart attack at 46. He'd spent his adult life in the military, rising to the rank of sergeant before retiring, never married, never had kids, never returned to Kentucky. His army buddies said he was a good soldier but distant, unreachable, like there was a wall around him that no one could penetrate. They didn't know about the Thornton case, didn't connect the quiet sergeant from Colorado with the national news story about the House of Horrors in Kentucky. At David's funeral, which Emma attended alone because Jacob couldn't bring himself to go, there was a moment during the eulogy when Emma broke down, not from grief, exactly, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that they'd all been victims in different ways. That Martin Thornton had destroyed every person in that family, even the ones he never touched. That trauma is a contagion, spreading through households and generations, touching everyone, sparing no one. The research on families like the Thorntons is extensive but unsatisfying. Psychologists have studied them, sociologists have analyzed them, criminal profilers have categorized them, but there's something about cases like this that resists academic understanding. You can map the patterns, can identify the risk factors and the warning signs and the systemic failures, can build models and frameworks and theories, but you can't really explain how a mother can hear her daughter screaming and choose to ignore it. Can't quite capture how a father can look at his 11-year-old child and decide she exists for his use. Can't fully articulate how siblings can know what's happening and say nothing, do nothing, learn to function in a house where evil is the daily routine. Evil is too small a word for it. Monster is too mythological. These were people, regular people with social security numbers and driver's licenses and dental appointments. They paid taxes. They mowed the lawn. They existed in society, participated in community, maintained the appearance of normalcy while committing atrocities behind closed doors, and that's the truly terrifying thing, not that monsters exist, but that they look like everyone else. That the worst abuse happens in homes that look like every other home on the street. That children are being destroyed right now, this moment, in houses with tidy lawns and welcome mats, and no one knows because no one's looking, because we've all agreed to respect privacy, to mind our business, to not pry into what happens in other people's homes. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbour who finally called the police, died in 2016. In her last interview, given to a local paper, she said the guilt had never left her, that she'd known something was wrong for years but hadn't acted, that she'd seen Sarah Mee's eyes that day in the backyard and known she was looking at someone in hell but had convinced herself it wasn't her place to interfere. I killed her just as much as they did, Mrs. Patterson said, maybe not with my hands but with my silence. We all did, the whole town. We knew something was off about that family, but knowing and acting are different things, and we chose not to act. I'll die with that. We all will. She was right. The people of Harlan County do carry it, maybe not consciously, maybe not in ways they'd articulate, but it's there, in the way they change the subject when someone mentions Morgan Road, in the way they avoid driving past the house. In the collective agreement never to speak the name Thornton unless absolutely necessary, small towns remember, maybe not in history books or official records, but in the way people move through space, in the stories they tell and don't tell, in the silence that surrounds certain topics like a moat around a castle. The Thornton story is part of Harlan County now. Woven into its identity, a cautionary tale, a source of shame, a reminder that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but creeps in quietly and builds its kingdom in the basement while everyone upstairs pretends not to hear. True crime community has made Sarah Mee something of a tragic icon. Her story gets told and retold in podcasts and documentaries and YouTube videos. People analyze what went wrong, debate what could have been done differently, argue about Rebecca's culpability versus her victimhood, pass the moral dimensions of the case with the luxury of distance and safety. Most of these discussions miss the point. They're looking for lessons, for takeaways, for some kind of meaning or moral that makes the story bearable. But some stories don't have morals. Some stories are just documentation of suffering, records of what humans can do to each other when all the normal barriers break down. Sarah Mee's story doesn't teach us anything we didn't already know. That abuse happens, that systems fail, that families can be prisons, that some damage is irreversible. We knew all of this before. The Thornton case just illustrated it in such stark, undeniable terms that we couldn't look away. But we did look away, eventually, because we always do. The news cycle moves on. New horrors emerge to capture our attention. The Thornton case faded from headlines, from conversation, from collective consciousness, until it became just another dark story from American history, filed away with all the others, remembered only by specialists and survivors and people like you, watching this video, learning about it for the first time or remembering it anew. In 2022, a developer bought the house on Morgan Road, plans to tear it down, build something new, luxury townhomes, maybe, or a small commercial space. The town council approved it quickly, quietly, grateful to finally be rid of this monument to their failure. The demolition is scheduled for sometime this year, 2025. Soon there will be nothing left but an empty lot where something terrible once stood. But you can't demolish memory, can't bulldoze trauma. The people who lived through this, who survived it or witnessed it or failed to prevent it, they carry the house inside them. It exists in their nightmares, in their therapy sessions. In the moments they look at their own children and wonder if they're capable of protecting them better than the Thorntons protected Sarah Mee. Grace has never visited the site, never been back to Kentucky at all. Says she doesn't need to see the physical place to remember what happened there. Says the house exists perfectly well in her mind, preserved in excruciating detail. Every room and hallway and staircase leading down into darkness. Says that's burden enough without adding the real-world location to it. She's probably right. Some pilgrimages aren't healing. Some places should remain unvisited. The house on Morgan Road is a grave site, and not every grave needs to be stood over to be honored. What do we do with stories like this? How do we process them? How do we hold the knowledge that a girl spent 4 years in a basement being raped by her father while her mother walked overhead and the world went on as normal? We can't process it, not really. We can feel horror and revulsion and profound sadness. We can commit to being more vigilant, to watching for signs, to believing children when they speak up. We can advocate for better systems, stronger protections, more resources for victims. We can do all of that, and it still won't be enough because abuse like this happens in the gaps between our best efforts, in the spaces our systems can't reach, in families that look fine from the outside while rotting from within. The Thornton case isn't exceptional. That's the worst part. It's extreme, yes. It went on for an unusually long time, and the circumstances of Grace's birth make it particularly disturbing. But familial abuse of this nature happens more than we want to acknowledge. In cities and suburbs and rural counties, across all economic levels and racial groups and religious affiliations, behind doors that look exactly like your door, your neighbor's door, the door of that nice family down the street who always waves hello. We don't want to believe this, want to believe that monsters are rare, that we'd recognize them if we saw them, that our communities are safe. But wanting doesn't make it true. And the cost of our collective denial is measured in destroyed lives like Sarah Mee's, in children suffering in silence, in families imploding while maintaining the facade of normalcy. Sarah Mee never got her life back. How could she? The life that was taken from her at 11 years old, the person she could have been, that future died in the basement of the house on Morgan Road, and no amount of justice or therapy or time could resurrect it. She survived, yes, she lived 56 years, but survival isn't the same as living, breathing isn't the same as thriving. She existed in the aftermath of her trauma, never quite escaping its gravity, never quite finding solid ground. And maybe that's the real lesson, if there is one, that some victories are just smaller losses, that some survival is just slower dying, that the girl who walked out of that house in 1998 wasn't the same girl who'd been imprisoned there, couldn't be, because that girl was gone. And the woman who took her place was assembled from fragments and scar tissue and will and spite, and a determination not to let her father take absolutely everything, even though he'd already taken the most important things. Grace carries this knowledge too, carries the understanding that she exists because of an atrocity, that her life began with an act of violence, that she's built from pain, literal and metaphorical. She's tried to make peace with this, has worked with her therapists to separate her identity from her origin, to understand that she's not responsible for the circumstances of her birth, that she deserves love and happiness and a full life despite everything. But knowledge and feeling are different things, and Grace still feels wrong sometimes, still feels like a walking crime scene, still looks at her children and wonders what genetics they've inherited, what capacity for darkness might be coded in their DNA alongside Martin Thornton's blue eyes. She knows intellectually that abuse isn't genetic, that her father was made, not born, that his monstrosity came from choices, not chromosomes, but fear isn't intellectual. And the fear that she might somehow pass on his capacity for harm, that her children might carry some invisible mark of the Thornton curse. That fear wakes her up at 3 in the morning and follows her through her days, and probably always will. The children themselves know nothing. Grace has told them their grandfather died before they were born. Their grandmother too. No extended family on that side. Just them and their father's family and the clean narrative of a normal life. It's a lie, but a merciful one. Maybe someday she'll tell them. Maybe when they're older, stronger, better equipped to handle it. Or maybe she'll take the story to her grave and let it die with her generation, sparing her children the burden of knowing what they come from. There's no right answer. Secrets destroy families, but so does truth sometimes. Grace is trying to navigate between these two impossibilities, to find some path that protects her children while also honoring what Sarah Mee endured. It's an impossible calculus. She does her best. That's all anyone can do. The house on Morgan Road will be gone soon, reduced to rubble and hauled away. The land will be cleared. Something new will be built. And in a generation or two, no one will remember what stood there before. The story will fade into local legend, then forgotten history, then nothing at all. But Sarah Mee existed, Grace exists, the twins exist, carrying their shame and guilt into old age. The town exists, still grappling with its collective failure. The victims and survivors and witnesses all exist, all carrying fragments of this story inside them like shrapnel that can't be removed. And now you know too. You've heard this story, watched this video, learned about the daughter who bore her own sister. And you carry it now, part of the invisible web of people who know what happened at the end of Morgan Road, who bear witness to Sarah Mee's suffering even though you never knew her, never met her, never had the chance to tell her you're sorry, that she deserved better, that what happened to her was evil and wrong and should never have been allowed to continue for so long. That's all we can do for her now. Remember, witness, refuse to let her story be buried completely. Refuse to let the world forget that she existed, that she suffered, that she survived as long as she could before the cumulative weight of her trauma finally crushed her. Sarah Mae Thornton was born in 1965 and died in 2021. She spent 20 years being systematically destroyed by her father and abandoned by her mother. She spent another 6 years trying to build something from the ruins. She never quite succeeded. But she tried. God, she tried. And maybe that's worth something. Maybe that's worth remembering. The house will fall. The story will fade. But for this moment, right now, as you watch this video, Sarah Mee is remembered. Her suffering is acknowledged, her existence is validated, and perhaps that's the only justice we can offer those who didn't receive it while they lived, the simple act of bearing witness, of saying their name, of refusing to look away even when looking hurts. Sarah Mee Thornton, remember that name, remember her story. Remember that she was real, that this happened, that houses of horror exist in ordinary neighborhoods and children suffer in silence and systems fail, and people look away and evil thrives in the gaps between our good intentions and our actual vigilance. Remember, that's all we can do. Remember and do better. Protect the children in our lives. Believe them when they speak. Question the families that seem too perfect. Push past the discomfort of prying. Accept that privacy, while valuable, cannot be an excuse for allowing abuse to continue unchecked. The Thorntons looked normal, seemed fine, went to church and worked their jobs and raised their kids and committed atrocities every single day for decades. And everyone missed it. Everyone failed, the neighbors, the teachers, the doctors, the police who could have investigated sooner, the church that could have seen, the social workers who could have checked. Everyone, let that sit with you, let it disturb you, let it make you uncomfortable, because comfort is what allowed this to happen. The comfort of not asking difficult questions, the comfort of accepting surface explanations. The comfort of minding our own business while children die slowly in the house next door. Sarah Mee died alone in a pandemic lockdown, isolated and forgotten, her mind deteriorating, her body giving up after decades of carrying trauma it was never meant to bear. She deserved better. She deserved to be saved at 11 years old. She deserved a mother who protected her and a father who loved her properly and a community that paid attention and a world that gave a damn about what happened to vulnerable children. She didn't get any of that. She got horror and suffering and a lifetime of trying to survive the unsurvivable. And in the end, the trauma won. It always wins. You can fight it, can manage it, can build a life around it. But you never really escape. Sarah Mee never escaped. She just endured until she couldn't anymore. That's the truth of stories like this. They don't have happy endings. They don't have redemption or healing or meaningful closure. They just have ending. The suffering ends because the survivor finally, mercifully, stops breathing. And what's left behind is a cautionary tale that no one really learns from because learning would require fundamental changes to how we structure society, how we protect children, how we intervene in families, and those changes are hard and uncomfortable and expensive, and we'd rather just tell ourselves that cases like the Thorntons are rare, exceptional, couldn't happen here, but they do happen here. They're happening right now, as you watch this, as I tell this story. Somewhere in America, a child is being abused by someone who should protect them. Someone knows or suspects, and they're choosing not to act. And years from now, that child will either die or escape. And if they escape, they'll spend the rest of their life trying to process trauma that never should have been inflicted. And we'll all shake our heads and say how terrible, how could this have happened? Why didn't anyone see the signs? As if we haven't heard this same story 1,000 times before. As if we don't know exactly why it happens. Because we choose comfort over courage, politeness over protection, privacy over the safety of children. Sarah Mee Thornton is dead. Martin Thornton is dead. Rebecca Thornton is dead. The house will soon be demolished. The story is effectively over. All that remains is the echoes, Grace trying to build a normal life, the twins carrying their shame, the town of Harlan County bearing the weight of its collective failure. And now you, the viewer, adding your awareness to the long chain of people who know what happened and must decide what, if anything, to do with that knowledge. Will you look at the children in your life differently? Will you pay attention to the families that seem wrong somehow? Will you speak up when you suspect something, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you might be wrong, even if it means social consequences? Or will you file this story away as an interesting horror, a disturbing case, something that happened to someone else, somewhere else, sometime else, and return to your life unchanged? That's not a judgment. It's just a question because most people file it away. Most people can't sustain the level of vigilance required to prevent tragedies like this. We get tired, we get distracted, we have our own lives and problems and concerns. And slowly, gradually, we stop paying attention, stop seeing, stop questioning, and somewhere, in that gap where attention fades, another Martin Thornton is putting a lock on a basement door. Another Rebecca Thornton is choosing to ignore what she knows. Another Sarah Mee is learning that no one is coming to save her, and the cycle continues. The video ends here. The story doesn't. It never does. Stories like this echo forward through time, touching lives, changing perspectives, occasionally inspiring action, but more often just adding to the general background horror of existence. You'll remember this story for a while. Then it will fade. Then maybe something will remind you of it years from now, and you'll remember the daughter who bore her own sister, and you'll feel that same sick twist in your stomach, and then you'll move on again because you have to. Because you can't carry every tragedy, because life requires forward motion even when the past is screaming behind you. Sarah Mee Thornton tried to move forward. She tried for 26 years, and maybe that's the closest thing to heroism available to survivors of trauma this profound. Not thriving, not overcoming, just continuing, just getting up every morning despite every reason not to, just breathing one more day in a world that took everything and gave nothing back, she's at rest now. Whatever peace was unavailable to her in life, perhaps she's found in death. That's what we tell ourselves anyway. What we have to believe to make stories like this bearable, that suffering ends, that the dead find peace. That there's some kind of cosmic justice beyond the fumbling, inadequate justice of human systems. Maybe it's true, maybe it's comforting fiction. It doesn't matter. Sarah Mee is beyond our reach now. Beyond pain and memory and the terrible weight of existence, all we can do is remember her, tell her story, use it as fuel for change if we can, or at least as a reminder of what happens when we all fail collectively, spectacularly, to protect the vulnerable among us. Thank you for watching. Thank you for bearing witness. Thank you for not looking away. If this story affected you, if it made you think or feel or question, then perhaps Sarah Mee's suffering wasn't entirely meaningless. Perhaps the story she never wanted to tell, but had to tell, serves some purpose in the world. Perhaps you'll remember, when it matters, that houses of horror exist, and children suffer, and silence enables evil. Perhaps that's all we have, perhaps and maybe and hope, and the impossible task of doing better than the generations before us, who also knew these stories and also failed to prevent the next one. The house on Morgan Road will fall. Remember that it stood. Remember who suffered there. Remember Sarah Mee. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.